Everyone, participants and speaker alike, to episode number 1 on the ECOP Australia New Zealand webinar series. Today we'll have a presentation followed by time for Q&A, and we'll have a survey also from the ECOP note at the end, so please fill it out to help us improve the webinar series. I'll share the recording after today's webinar. So if you want to go back to the content, you will be able to do so. So I'd like to introduce today's speaker. We have Dr. Pat Hanna from CSIRO Publishing. He completed his PhD in plant biochemistry in 2025 and wrote much of his thesis while he was working full-time for CSIRO Publishing, which is a nonprofit publisher. He's the journal manager at CSIRO Publishing and oversees day-to-day publishing workflows, as well as supports editorial boards and maintains relationship with society partners and contributors. Working within this nonprofit environment also allowed Pat to examine the systemic pressures that are placed on researchers, both by publishers and institutions. And through conversations with colleagues across publishing and academia, he has focused on educating early career ocean professionals about the process and about journal ethics, trying to strengthen representation of Indigenous researchers and promote diversity within his editorial boards and submitting authors. Pat, welcome today. Thank you very much for agreeing to talk to us, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Rita. It's still weird hearing the word doctor get put before my name. I don't really use it in a professional sense very often, but it is always nice to be reminded that I did do a PhD. You'll notice straight off the bat here, and I'm very sorry about this, I've forgotten to change the date on this presentation. So you are receiving a presentation that I do give quite a bit, but I try and build upon it each time. Within this presentation, there are points in which I do ask the audience for a little bit of input. So if you are able to, you are welcome to drop some input within the chat when those moments arise. Otherwise, you can bring yourself off mute if you would like to contribute something desperately. But as Rita suggested, there will be opportunity at the end for a bit of a Q&A. So if you do have a long question that you would like to ask, save it to the end and we can discuss it then. So as Rita suggested, I've been in the publishing sphere for about 2.5 years now, since August 2023. In my time in publishing, I've been a journal manager. I work across about 16 different journals that cover fields of ecology to chemistry to miscellaneous areas in social science and such. And what I want to start off today's presentation with is a bit of an acknowledgement of how difficult it is to be a researcher these days. This is a little excerpt from a paper that was published in 2024 that was talking about the various forms of academic pressure. And what I want to focus on here is the pressure that is felt by early career researchers, where there's this perceived or real time pressure, which leads to a lack of time sovereignty or a perceived lack of time sovereignty for early career researchers. And this in turn leads to negative early career researchers negatively engaging with the system in which they are a part of. This ultimately leads to a lot of people leaving academia towards industry or leaving research altogether, which is a real difficult situation to be in for our industry. And the reason why this is kind of occurring is because academics in the modern age are pulled in all sorts of different directions. We have to conduct research, but that research isn't just research. It usually has to produce positive results. We also have to produce revenue-producing research a lot of the time for the institutions that we work for. And that research itself also has to be impactful, which is defined differently by different people within our industry, depending on what research area you're working on. You may define impact by pure citations or by policy citations. You also have to teach, apply for grants, write papers, review papers. You have admin duties, leadership roles, community engagement, all kinds of things. And wrapped up into all of that, you also have to find time to have a personal life, because believe it or not, if you don't make time for that, you're going to end up burning out. And what this all culminates in is an academic that feels relatively isolated within the system in which they work in. They're getting pulled in different directions by grant bodies, by institutions that they work at, and finally by publishers. There's other inputs into the system, but these are the three that I'm going to focus on for today. And by being pulled in all of these different directions, it ultimately leads to just a feeling of exhaustion for most researchers. Exhaustion ultimately leads to apathy within systems, and apathy of a general cohort of contributors to an industry will usually lead to silent change being enacted upon that industry. This completes the cycle back towards exhaustion, where you ultimately feel a little bit lost and out of the loop with the direction in which your industry is heading. So how does all of this relate to publishing? Well, in publishing, we rely on academics to complete peer reviews for papers that are published. We rely on academics to train themselves effectively in order to write papers that are of a significant quality to be published in the first place. And we also rely, well, there we go. We also rely on academics to produce these manuscripts of high quality, which in turn provide impact to publishers so that more authors might want to publish with them. And an issue that we face in the industry at the moment is this need for speed within academia, this want to produce papers at such a pace that it maybe works against the true purpose of what academia lives for. And this is this idea of publish or perish. You've probably heard of this before from supervisors, from colleagues, from people you've met at conferences or seminars like this one. And what this has done, this idea that we have to publish or perish within a specific time frame, over the course of the last 15, 20 years, it's really opened the door for bad actors, for poor science, and ultimately rushed science within our industry. And an example you can see for where this has affected academia in a really negative light is through sources like Retraction Watch. Retraction Watch has kept updated all of the retractions that have taken place in academic circles since around about 2001. And as you can see here, they've tracked 68,000 retractions across the entire academic industry in that time. Now, this probably represents a very small proportion of the actual number of published papers within the industry, but keep in mind that retractions can occur years after the fact. And where it used to be that these retractions were isolated incidents or isolated researchers who have either made mistakes or have been bad actors in the past, it's becoming, this publish or perish identity has developed an industry that is ripe to be taken advantage of by actors who want to either profit or sow misinformation into our academic infrastructures. So how should we interact with the publishing process? First of all, we need to make sure that academics continue to review. This means that as a publisher, we need to provide an environment that is encouraging early academics to early, mid, and experienced academics to review because they see value in it or they see it as part of their role within the broader academic infrastructure. We need to make sure that we as a publisher are offering opportunities for researchers to upskill both in their writing and their ability to interact with the academic infrastructure. And we need to make sure that we are providing frameworks in which people can choose journals that they see best support their communities. So I'm going to start with reviewing. This is going to be a relatively quick part here because I want to focus more on the community elements with today's presentation. So first of all, we've probably all heard this rule of if you publish one paper, it means you should probably be reviewing 2 papers in return to return the favor to those reviewers who have critically analyzed your work. Now, the assumption that this makes is that every paper that you submit will go on to be published. I hate to break it to anyone in the audience today, but not all of your papers will be published. A lot of them will be rejected. Probably about half of them will be rejected during your lifetime. Now, this does not mean that that paper won't eventually go on and be published after some critical analysis from yourself and your colleagues. But what you should consider is that for every paper you submit, you're reviewing 2 papers in return. What this does is it makes sure that every paper that you submit that may go out to review and be reviewed by two people who are giving their time to you, usually for free, you are returning that favor to the ecosystem in which you are working in. Now, for my first point of discussion today, you can engage with this in the chat if you like. First of all, have we reviewed a paper before? And if you have reviewed a paper before, do you think you are qualified to review that paper? Or what was maybe a challenge that you faced while reviewing that paper? And beyond that, how would you suggest others build their reviewing skills based on your experience in academia? I'm happy for people to come off mute. Otherwise, I can jump straight on to the next slide.
I'm happy to contribute here, Pat, if you don't mind. I can see people are writing, but it's always good to have a first person to incite the masses. So I have reviewed papers, and I usually only accept requests to review if I think I'm qualified based on the abstract. If I have any questions on whether I'm qualified, I will usually write to the editor that invited me and mention what is my concern or my doubt and let them advise me whether they think I'm qualified or not. So that happens more often, for example, with statistics. So if they mention some statistics in the abstract that I'm unfamiliar with, I'll usually email the editor and say, look, I can review this, but I'm not very familiar with the statistics. So if you want someone to review that, you should either invite someone else or get another reviewer to comment on that. And as for suggestions for people to build their reviewing skills, I just wanted to tell people there are a few courses out there, some free, some not, on how to peer review. So I know Nature has a masterclass. I know there are a couple others. I can't remember right now off the top of my head, but I can provide that resource later if people are interested in it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I would always point people towards, is that look for ways to upskill yourself in reviewing. And I'll touch on 2 further ones outside of just course development that you can lean on that may be a little closer in proximity to you or a little less effort. Maria, the comment on imposter syndrome is, I think, the one that always comes up in webinars like this. And honestly, I wish I could do an entire TED talk on why I think imposter syndrome is a little bit ridiculous in academic circles. But I get why we have it. Like, I think imposter syndrome is one of these things where it's a result of being intelligent enough to know your limitations. But sometimes when we're an early career researcher, because we are in this constant loop of learning new things, of making mistakes on protocols, we're so often questioning whether we're qualified to be doing even the basic tasks within our research field. I would say that reviewing is one of these things where it's an opportunity for you to critically engage in your field. You read enough papers, you perform enough protocols, and looking at papers that you're asked to review and going, have I used this method before? Yes or no? I'm probably qualified to review this paper based on that alone, because you can comment on whether that methodology was appropriate in that circumstance, or whether it was carried out properly, or whether the reporting and data that is presented afterwards are realistic outputs of using that methodology in the first place. These are the things that you can use when, looking at these papers that you may be asked to review. Because reality is like everyone's in the same boat. Most people do feel like an imposter. And being a reviewer doesn't mean that you're saying you know more than that person, but it's sitting down at a family table and having a discussion about, have you thought of doing this? Did you think about this enough? And a few other suggestions I would always encourage is, if you have a supervisor who you trust and you feel like you have a good relationship with, lean on them as much as you can. Their role so often in your career is to be a mentor. And part of being a mentor is helping with things like this, about teaching you how to be a good reviewer, or the things you should look for in a paper when it is given to you at first glance. The other thing I would encourage you all to do, and this seems like a really obvious one, but I used to do it all the time when I was an early career researcher, of just reading papers and not really critically engaging with it. Like just taking it on face value and not going, was this protocol useful in this space? Were the were the graphs appropriate? Were they easy to read? Like even stuff like that, comments on, it was difficult to understand what you were trying to say here. Try saying it in a different way. You're the first reader to read this paper. The author knows what they're trying to say, but sometimes they don't articulate it correctly. And as a reviewer, those are comments that you can provide to help with the clarity of work, not just the substance. So when you're reading papers, and these are version of record papers, critically engage with those papers and consider, has this author articulated themselves correctly? Have they presented this graph correctly in this space? And learn from those things. Take it into your own writing, take it into your comments that you may offer in reviews. And then, of course, what Rita said as well, look out for workshops. There will be ones provided by institutions outside of where you work, but your institution will usually provide writing or reviewing workshops that you can engage in as well. There's also sometimes reviewer workshops at conferences that you might attend, and take the time to go and upskill yourselves when you do have the opportunities, particularly when it's free. So in terms of upskilling, the other aspect to upskilling that I like to talk about is often about this idea of communication. That, we've probably all heard this quote before, that science is not finished until it's communicated. And if you're like me, my first step into science was when I did English or literature for the first time, and realized that I was really terrible at writing or not very good at articulating myself. So I moved towards science, where it didn't seem very necessary to be as good at articulating yourself in high school, at least. And then, of course, you get into your postgraduate work and you realize, God damn it, the whole thing is just English or literature or writing. And you actually it is a skill that you have to be good at. And I think it's often a skill that is ignored by a lot of people who are working in academia, because we don't spend the time to upskill ourselves in these spaces. So the things that I would always encourage, and I like to try and offer easy solutions to these, or just get you to think differently when you're doing tasks that you're going to be doing anyway. First of all, is just to practice your writing, and not just writing, right, and putting words on a page, but critically engaging with that process. If you write a paragraph, step away from it for a week and come back to it a week after, and look at it with fresh eyes and go, oh, I have not articulated myself very well there. Or give it to a colleague, I used to give it to family members and be like, particularly if it's part of an introduction or a discussion, people who have no background in this area, and go, can you understand what I'm saying here? Is it coherent? Is the clarity, is it there? Are you going to be able to read this and understand the basic thesis of what I'm trying to say? Engaging with the process of writing like that is essential to making yourself a better communicator, and not just in producing publications, but in presenting at conferences, in preparing posters, in writing grants. It's useful in all of these different elements of your work that you're going to have to contribute to later on in your career, or maybe are already doing now. Secondly, similar to reviewing, identify what other people do well. When you see someone give a presentation, or if you get a review back on a paper that you've submitted, or if you're reading a paper for the first time, identify what other people are doing well and absorb that into your own writing, or your own methods of communication. It's not cheating, it's not a shortcut. It's how we all get better together. And if we identify those things that we're doing well as a community, everybody gets better with that. Lastly, and the thing that I would encourage the most, is learn to communicate in uncomfortable places. This is both in your writing and in your presentations. I mentioned before, I used to give papers to my family, and that may sound like a weird thing to some people here. My family was very kind, and they're quite large, so If one was annoyed at me, I could usually go to another one. But that's an uncomfortable place to communicate. And it's not uncomfortable because you feel like you're going to get backchat from the people you're communicating with. But oftentimes it means that you have to change the way in which you communicate in order to get a message across. How I would communicate plant biochemistry to another plant biochemist is different how I would articulate the same message and conclusions to someone who works in meteorology. People have different skill sets, and you need to make sure you adapt language to meet those needs, which sometimes means you need to emphasize a point in different ways multiple times. So learning to communicate in uncomfortable places, even if you don't do it perfectly the first time, is one of the best ways to improve and upskill yourself within academia. So onto the larger portion of this presentation, and this is about choosing journals that respect your community. I think oftentimes in academia, and I'm sure we've all been exposed to it, we fall victim of talking about publishing, and we often feel like we have no power within that system. And the reality is that this isn't true. Academics have a lot of power within publishing, and it's just a matter of recognizing where you can point your feet in order to make the most amount of change. And the questions that I want you to engage with today is, what does a journal have to be? What does a journal do for me? And lastly, what does a journal do for my community? And you'll notice that none of these questions have anything to do with impact factor, with downloads, with readership. It's broad questions to engage yourself in the system and make sure you're moving towards an answer that aligns more closely with your ethics and your morals. And once we've answered all of these questions, we're probably going to end up with a pool of journals, and we're going to tie all of that together with metrics as a final barrier for choice rather than the first thing that we consider. So first of all, we have to address this question of, what does a journal have to be? This considers questions like, what does your university say? Where do you have to publish if you are a part of that university? How do they judge you on performance? What does your network say? So your supervisor, your colleagues, members of your society, people at conferences that you go and see. And lastly, what does your funding body say? The answers to all of these are a little bit different, right? So universities will often either externally or just internally have ideas around the level of quality of journals in which you should be publishing in. So this will usually emphasize publication within quartile 1 or quartile 2 journals within the impact factor ranking, whereas funding bodies might have stipulations around publishing open access. So ensuring that whatever journal you're publishing in has open access opportunities is essential to consider at this very first point. But lastly, and the one that I would always point you towards first, is to consider what your network says. Where have people had good experiences? Where have they found they've been taken care of and felt valued? Lean on those questions, lean on those answers and that feedback most of all, because that's coming from the people who you trust most. Before we go on, I just want to give an idea of what impact factor actually is, because I feel, particularly when I was a researcher, it's something you used to hear an awful lot. I never really put much thought into what impact factor actually is. So the calculation for impact factor is this. It's not super complicated, but it takes the number of citations within a single year that you've received, that a journal has received on publications published in the previous 2 years. So here you can see citations in 2024 on items published in 2022 and 2023. You take that bulk number of citations and divide it by the number of citable items within that 2-year window, and that gives you your final impact factor. Now, that's a very big impact factor. Most journals you see won't have impact factors like that. But what I would like you to do to engage critically with this information is to consider, what are the flaws in impact factor? So again, we can come off mute, we can drop it in the chat. No wrong answers on this, because I promise you there's a lot of critiques that people have of impact factor. I've maybe heard them all, but I'm always interested in hearing new ones.
Do you want to maybe go back to the previous slide to help people think about what could be flaws?
Again, if you feel frozen by imposter syndrome at this point, I'm not going to judge you for any answers that you give, Isla. It's just a discussion. That's all it is. Otherwise, I do have some points that I can bring up to maybe drive your minds in a certain direction. Yeah, time range is rather limited. It's usually the first thing I point to. I think it's one of these things where time range, it isn't super important unless we're judging between research categories, right? But then maybe as well, it doesn't consider how often certain types of research are coming out within those research categories. So the reason why this is important is, and we'll take the broadest example that I can think of, is that let's compare medical fields to history, right? Because there's a lot of history, social science journals. Medicine will be publishing thousands and thousands of papers every single year. With each additional paper that comes into the system, that is an opportunity for more citations. Remembering there's more than one reference per paper, so you've got maybe 40 to 80 citations per paper that gets published. That's an enormous amount of citations within a single year that can be disposed upon those publications that came out in the previous 2 years. You compare that to history, which may only have hundreds of papers coming out per year, which reduces the bulk load of available citations. And because those papers consider publications probably over a larger spectrum of publication history, not all of those citations or a lower proportion of those are going to consider those papers within the previous 2-year window, which means that those impact factors for history journals are going to be far lower than what you would see for medical journals. Like most cited papers or journals harder, or maybe other journals to be cited. Well, yeah, okay, so this is also an interesting thing, right? So impact factor is definitely a feedback loop. It's less of a feedback loop than what it used to be, but remember the impact factor, one of the main reasons why it was first created was to allow libraries to best judge the highest quality journals. The highest quality journals then got subscriptions to those universities. Now, before open access was even a thing, that meant that only those journals that had subscriptions could be seen by academics at those universities, which means that they had a higher likelihood of receiving citations, right? So if you didn't have a subscription at that university, you had a lower probability of receiving a citation, which meant that those journals that had subscriptions had a better opportunity at receiving higher impact factors, which means that they got more subscriptions. So it was this feedback loop constantly of get a subscription, boost your impact factor. Now that we've entered open access, it's a little less in that stage, but not all papers are open access. So if you are a profitable multinational publisher who's more capable of supporting open access, you probably now have a greater opportunity to produce higher impact factor journals. Now, I'll move on because there's other stuff to talk about. We've talked about between disciplines. I won't touch on this last one, but the one that I do want to focus on is this one here about negative citations. You'll notice in this calculation, it is raw citations. It doesn't decipher between positive, neutral, or negative citations. So what this means is that if a paper is published in a journal and it isn't retracted for being false, right? Or maybe it's a little bit out there, that paper can receive a lot of citations from other papers, basically informing people that this paper is crap and here's my response. That positively affects impact factor for that journal in the long run, despite the fact that it's not actually it might not actually be a great paper. So this inability to decipher between positive and negative citations within this impact factor system means that some journals may like to live on the edge and do things that are a little bit reactionary in order to build citations on research articles. Moving on, we're going to focus on this question about, I'll come back to that a little bit later, Joel. Tricky question. What does this journal do for me? So we have this, I've broken this down into 3 questions. There are other questions that you can consider here, but I mentioned at the start of this, we don't have a lot of time as academics. So trying to build this framework around time availability was a big, a big motivation for me. So what does this journal do for me? First of all, considering whether we have publishing agreements at your institutions. Publishing agreements provide free open access to you, the author, because your institution is paying a subscription to that journal. So it's usually called a transition agreement or a read and publish agreement. And what you can do is on your university library sites is they'll usually have a massive database of all of the journals that they have subscriptions to. It can sometimes be a little bit difficult to find depending on the university that you're at, but usually if you ask someone from the library, they'll be able to point you in the right direction. And what this database will show you is a big spreadsheet of all of the journals that the university has an agreement with, whether those agreements are capped, meaning that they can only publish a certain amount of journals within that agreement every single, a certain amount of publications in that journal over the course of a year, or they may be uncapped, meaning that you can publish as many times in them as possible. What this does is it reduces the monetary burden on individual authors and moves it onto the institution, similar to how the old subscription service used to work for non-open access content. Secondly, you should probably consider turnaround times. I mentioned before this idea of publish or perish and the need for speed within academia and how it's maybe a negative thing. Turnaround times, although this is, this is a useful thing to consider. I wouldn't be choosing journals that are promising you a turnaround time of like 6 days to 14 days, because either it's not realistic or there's something shady going on in the background, but choosing journals that are giving you a realistic window of, I feel like my paper has been assessed within this time, it's been assessed critically, but it's not holding me up from being published. So it's not taking, a year to get through peer review, but maybe it's taking a month or 2 to get through peer review. Lastly, considering where your journal is indexed. So in this consideration, you should be asking yourself, where do I see content that is relevant for me? That may be ResearchGate. Most of the time, we just look up on Google Scholar, right? Or Web of Science. Making sure that it's indexed within services that you see your content most often is super important. First of all, even if you're not using those services to find content all the time, those services inform algorithms that Google Scholar or just Google utilize for keyword searches. So if your journal is indexed in PubMed, it's probably going to appear further up the algorithm than a journal that isn't indexed in PubMed if you're working in medical fields or medical adjacent fields. So that kind of stuff is really important to consider. Where is my journal indexed? How quickly is my paper going to get published? And also, do I need to pay for services like open access? Speaking of open access, some of us may not have been exposed to this before, but back in yonder year, how academia used to work is that we, the academics, would publish for free, and essentially people would have to pay to read the content. Now, this became an issue as academia grew and became a more global institution, particularly within the 21st century. And there was this need, or a relative need, for content to be freely accessible to read. This is for both the public, other academics, and people in the global south who were usually ostracized from the academic conversations. Unfortunately, what this did is it flipped this service putting the monetary pressure on authors. So you had to pay to publish, but the content became free to read. In terms of discussion for this, and if we don't have anything to add here, that's okay. But I want you to consider, what additional challenges does open access put in front of researchers? It's okay if we don't have anything, because I can skip on to the next one. We've covered one a little bit already, and that's this idea of access for authors. So the monetary pressures now being put on authors. They have to pay in order to publish open access to make their content as accessible to as many people as possible. But if you don't have things like agreements with your institution to access that content, or the ability to claim a waiver through that journal, or if the journal isn't Diamond OA, you feel that your access to contributing to discussion is limited. So it puts this additional pressure on top of these time pressures and this constant need to validate your own existence on researchers, which seems relatively unfair in a fast-paced system like academia is these days. That's an example of the spreadsheet with all of our read and publish agreements on them. That one's from the University of Melbourne. It was relatively difficult to find the first time. So I recommend, as a brief exercise after today's webinar, see if you can go and find your transitional agreements or read and publish agreements on your library website at your institutions. Turnaround times will usually be available on journal websites, usually in the About the Journal section, as will indexing information for that journal. The last one, and the one that I think I care most about, is asking yourself this question about, what does a journal do for my community? I think the key element to this is asking yourself whether that journal supports the most vulnerable members of your community. So that means people who are from the global south who may not have access or funding that allows them to publish open access, and that institutions may not have that funding either that allows them to have read and publish or transitional agreements. So there are opportunities for publishers to sign up to these publishing agreements that support access for these lower income nations. So a good example of one is called Research for Life. And if you go on there, there's big lists of publishers who are signed up to this publishing agreement and the countries in which they support access to. It's important when considering these agreements about what that signatory is actually signing up for, because just because they're signed up to a publishing agreement doesn't mean they're offering the same as all of the other signatories. So for instance, us at CSIRO Publishing, we've signed up for Research for Life. We provide free open access and free access to non-open access content to all Group A countries, and we offer significant waivers to anyone from Group B countries, and provide access as well. So however, if you look at other publishers, they may not be offering full waivers to Group A countries. It may just be significant waivers and smaller waivers to Group B countries. They may not be providing access to non-open access content. It differs by publisher, but it's important to consider, if it's something that you really care about, it's important to consider how publishers and journals are engaging with the community that they're serving. Secondly, asking yourself if the diversity of editors represents your view of the field. Are you seeing a diversity in gender? Are you seeing a diversity in experience? Are you seeing a diversity in location of editors on that editorial board? If a journal is saying that it's an international journal, but most of its editors are from Europe and the US, maybe it's not as internationally focused as what it maybe should be, particularly if we're answering questions that have regional significance. Lastly, and probably the hardest one to obtain, is this question around diversity of authors. Again, similar to editors, do you see a diversity of gender, of experience, of location, of topics within a journal that seem relevant to your field? Are there things that you feel are getting left out of the conversation that you know would be getting submitted to this journal and would be relevant? Consider these questions when choosing journals because they are really important. If we're not pushing diversity at a grassroots level, it won't be considered at a, at a board level or a shareholder level as something that is important to consider when building journals or making decisions as a publisher. And lastly, and we'll come back to some of those diversity questions here after this metrics one, is to consider metrics. So we've got our answers to all of those questions that we've posed during this framework. Now we bring in metrics. We consider impact factor, but beyond impact factor, we consider things like 5-year impact factor. So that's pretty much a similar metric, but it goes over a 5-year window rather than a 2-year window. Consider things like how many downloads and viewers does a journal have? How many subscribers does it have? Consider things like site score, which is an alternative impact metric launched by Scopus, which is owned by Elsevier. So take it with a grain of salt, however you would like, but it offers a different kind of impact metric that considers things over a broader scope of time and also considers a broader window of citations for particular journals. But the one that I would always point people towards is SciMago, which is an independent impact resource. And what Scopus does really well is it provides you impact metrics by the SJR, which is their version of impact factor, but it also provides you metrics that might be difficult to find elsewhere. So how many papers does this journal produce each year? How many external citations does that journal receive compared to self-citations? How often do you see international collaboration appear within this journal? How many of the papers that are published within this journal end up uncited in any given year? And it also offers information on diversity. So how often do you see female authors within this journal? Remembering that questions like this aren't always looking for 50-50 representation, but more of a good representation of what you see in the field. So if you go to a conference and you see, well, there's 60% males that are at a high level here and 40% females, that's the kind of representation I would like to see at a journal level, right? It may be the other way around. You see 60% women and 40% men. Removing the factor that, there may be people who don't identify as either, it offers a good representation of the diversity that is represented within that journal and should be a key consideration when we're choosing which journals we think best support our community and best reflect our values of what a good journal should look like. So in total, this is what our framework looks like. We have our 4 categories with the questions that we should be asking. And then an acknowledgement of how short for time we often are as academics. I've highlighted there the ones that, if you are pushed for time, are the ones that you should consider most frequently. This is publishing agreements with your institution to avoid open access fees as often as possible, publishing agreements that support access for the most vulnerable members of your community, and then considering metrics from SciMago. Overarching all of that with considerations of what that journal has to be to best support your career based on what your university says, what your network says, and what your funding bodies say you have to publish in. And with that, I would like to thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to have questions. I don't have a meeting after this, so I can stay a little bit longer if need be. I do have a link there to a survey. It would be really helpful to me if you take the time. It takes maybe 5 minutes to go through and just asks you to rank which factors of journals you think are most important for you when you're considering which journal you would like to publish in. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pat. That was great. This is not the first time I've heard Pat speak about scientific publishing, and it's always great, and there's always some new information. Pat is happy to take questions. Please do fill out Pat's survey, help him out. I'll also provide that with the recording if you don't want to fill it out now, but you want to fill it out later. There are a couple of questions in the chat. Joel and Varshani, do you want to unmute yourselves and ask your questions, or would you like me to read them out? And anyone else that wants to ask as well, please do just unmute yourselves.
Hi, Pat.
Hi, Varshani.
I hope you can hear me. Yeah. So I was just wondering, it was a really nice presentation, and since I'm pretty new to all like journals and things, it was a lot of new information for me. So I was just curious to know if like, does the publication fee change depending on the journal you're publishing, depending on the impact factor or the popularity of that journal?
Yes, it absolutely does. And this is one of the major criticisms. If you're new to the field, you probably haven't been exposed to it too much yet, but it's one of the major criticisms you'll hear around publishing in general, is that there is an enormous range of publication fees. And it's often difficult to judge which one is a best direct measure of how much it actually costs to publish a paper in the modern age. But it usually increases with popularity of a journal or increase in impact factor. If you take Nature, for instance, Nature, it costs about, it may be a little bit different now, but when you translate it into Australian dollars, it's about $10,000 to publish an open access paper in Nature. This is representative of the fact that usually Nature papers have a really large author contribution, so they can pool money to provide publication of that paper. But you have to ask yourself, is that how much, is that value, is that $10,000 worth of value being received on the other end through publication in Nature? Some would argue absolutely yes. Others would argue probably not. I kind of sit on the fence with it. I think Nature does do a lot to support authors, more than a lot of journals and publishers. But if you look at the broader spectrum, I mean, sometimes it costs about $5,000. Baseline for a lot of the time is around about that $3,000 mark if you're looking at those mid-range publishers.
Oh, so yeah, so like 10,000 seems a lot, yeah, for a
Yeah.
publication. Yeah. So usually does universities and provide that kind of funding for publications?
So universities will usually, I'm happy to be corrected on this, but my understanding is that universities don't usually involve themselves with the payment of publication fees. Rather, it's on the funding body to provide enough funding to pay for these publication fees, or on the authors themselves to pool that money to pay for those fees. Rita, you may know more about that.
So with publication charges, if it's a journal that your institution has an agreement with, they will do that for you automatically. So for example, say your university has an agreement with CSIRO Publishing. When you submit your manuscript, and every time you do submit manuscripts, this is for everyone here, make sure you use your institutional email, because the publisher will automatically check if that institution has an agreement with the publisher. And if it does, then everything is kind of done automatically. You don't have to contact anyone at your institution or anything. You will usually just get emails that are sent back and forth between the publisher and the organization. If your organization doesn't have an agreement with the publisher that you've submitted your manuscript to, and that's a different thing. Then you're probably going to have to arrange for funds to be paid, and we'll have to communicate directly with the publisher about that.
Thank you so much, Pat and Rita. Yeah, it was really interesting. Yeah.
There are a couple of people in a noisy location, so I'll just read their questions, Pat, to you. So Joelle was asking whether the impact factor gets corrected for each year after papers get retracted.
Yeah, so impact factor does get corrected in hindsight often by Clarivate, not just for retractions, but not just for retractions of papers in that journal, but maybe you also have retractions of papers that cited publications in that journal. It's all a bit of a mess. Now, the issue with this is that, as I said, retractions often happen well after the fact. So your impact factor will be affected potentially 2 years after, rather than in the window. So if you're publishing with that journal, there's no way for you to know that that impact factor may not be a realistic impact factor based on the fact that that paper or papers affecting that impact factor have not yet been retracted. So that's where it gets a little bit messy, in that when you're making these decisions, you may not have all of the information available to you. And look, there's always going to be critiques of all types of impact metrics, but that one in particular, that 2-year window, and the issues pertaining to impact factor around negative citations, and the fact that it's maybe not as nuanced as what it needs to be, those are the difficult things to judge and measure as an academic.
Have a couple other questions. Aren't there also many journals that have both a fee for authors to publish and a fee to read, which I'm guessing is what is usually called the double dipping?
Yes, yeah. So this is the great challenge of academic publishing at the moment, is that at the moment we're caught in a bit of an in-between space where there are still papers being published that are non-open access, so you need to pay to read them, and there are papers that are getting published as open access. Now, there are journals that represent both of these parties. They're usually referred to as hybrid journals. And what they do is, yes, the author will need to pay to publish the open access article, but they don't receive any subscription revenue or pay to read revenue for that paper. At least not in my experience. There may be journals that are doing that, but they would usually be predatory ones. But they would also represent papers that the author hasn't paid to publish, and the reader will need to pay to read or access through a subscription with their institution. So this is that tricky in-between period for the industry, where I think it's going to move towards open access, if you're asking me to read the tea leaves, and we're going to end up in a fully open access environment eventually. But no one quite wants to make that leap right now and jump away from that. Part of this is because it's financially unstable for a lot of publishers to do that right now, where they've historically relied on subscription fees, and this has been a really repeatable financial strategy for them year on year to go from one to the other. But now, if they remove all of that subscription fee, they don't have a guarantee that the publication fees are going to then carry the load ongoing for them. So it's a really tricky and malleable space at the moment. It's going to look different in a year's time, and it'll look different in 10 years' time after that. But yeah, double dipping is definitely a thing that is happening within the industry.
I imagine that publishers will be looking at the number of papers they're publishing on a yearly basis and whether they've reached a baseline that at least would be similar. The revenue that they get in open access fees would be similar to what they would get in subscription charges. But that remains to be seen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And Miriam is also asking whether you have an idea of other ethical measures, for example, on science quality, and how you could check for those. For example, I know that in the past, Elsevier has given a platform to climate change denier opinion articles that were not written by climate scientists. These might be quite niche examples to find.
Yeah, my advice in these cases is always to rely on a diversity of inputs, much like you would when conducting an experiment, to reach a conclusion. No one metric is going to give you all of the information that you want to use. So using things like impact factor, site score, SciMago is really important to judge the quality of a journal, but then using more qualitative examples from your network, from news sources as well, is also really important. The tip I would give here, I mentioned Retraction Watch earlier on. I would highly recommend signing up to Retraction Watch. They have a subscriber email, gets delivered to your inbox once a day, and it gives you information on the publishing industry as a whole. A lot of the time you can just skip past it, but it's an opportunity for you to learn each day about publishing industry. But what they also have is they have a database of those retractions that have taken place, of the journals that have received a large amount of attention in the retraction space, and utilizing that information to help you inform your decision. Because one retraction doesn't mean a bad journal, but a pattern of retractions for similar reasons might represent a journal that is encouraging bad actors. So taking inputs like that and using it to build an entire picture is what I would always encourage you to do. The unfortunate thing for that is it does take time. Things like PeerPub as well are really good. They'll give you ideas of which journals are maybe getting the most questions post publication from people in the industry, and other forums. I can't think of too many off the top of my head aside from PeerPub, because that's one I used to use. But any forums where these types of things are discussed are also really important as well. And if you can find them, sign up to them, and you feel you can trust the contributors there, those are the things that I would encourage most.
Thanks, Pat. For everyone that needs to go because they have other commitments, please do fill out the ECOP survey about this webinar and how useful it's been to you whenever you get a chance. For those who can and would like to stay, Pat has kindly offered to answer some more questions. And Joelle is asking whether you have advice for ECRs to break through the cycle of paying ridiculous amounts of money just to publish. And how does an ECR get into being a reviewer? You know, where can we start?
Yeah, so for that first one, I think it's just a matter of recognizing your options. So I mentioned before that it's important, first of all, to always understand that when you're publishing, you should be looking after yourself first, and you should be publishing in places that are best going to support your career ongoing. Because if you don't support your own career, you're never going to be in a position in which you can either make meaningful change or encourage other people to make meaningful change. How you protect your career is by looking at what your institution and funding bodies require you to do. Now, a lot of them usually have guidelines of, we'll take, for instance, what it used to be in institutions, in that you have to publish in Q1 journals. Now, that requirement has been removed from a lot of institutions, not to say they don't still use it as a KPI for academics when considering them for promotion. So if you can publish in a Q1 journal, that is the first thing that you should be doing. Now, within research categories, it's important to note that Q1 journals, let's take plant science for instance. There are 400 journals within the plant science category, which means there's 100 Q1 journals that I could potentially publish in. You narrow that down for scope and for similarity to my research interests, and you'll find there may be potentially 8 to 15 journals that I can publish in within that window. Now I can take that pool, and that's why it's always the first question you ask yourself. Now I can take that pool of 15 journals and I can go on to my next questions and be like, do they have publishing agreements? If they don't have a publishing agreement, I have to pay for them. Maybe you don't consider them. If they're all removed at that step, which I doubt they would be, that's when you start to ask yourself, all right, well, which ones are the cheapest to publish in? Do I need to publish open access? Is that important for me in my career right now? Those are the kinds of things that you can consider there. So I would say that there's usually always going to be an avenue for you to escape paying a large amount of money to publish. You may still have to pay something if your institution doesn't have agreements, but you don't have to pay out the nose and $10,000 every time that you publish. In terms of how to get into reviewing, it's really hard as an ECR because most journals rely on their editorial boards and their networks to choose reviewers. And those editorial boards, networks, are usually just the people they've worked with in their career. So if you don't have members on editorial boards who are early career researchers, you often don't tap into early career researcher networks. long tangent to get there. What I would encourage you to do is that your supervisor is busy, right? They probably get asked to review a lot. Ask your supervisor if, if there's opportunities to review and they don't have time, to ask you if you want to review that paper instead, because publishers, journals, editorial board members will always usually say yes to that and be like, yes, absolutely, your student can review that or your postdoc can review that in your place, because it saves them time, it saves the author time. It means that that paper is not going back and forth looking for reviewers further down the line. So if you have a supervisor who's willing to help you out in that, definitely go ahead with that. I will also suggest that building your network is a really useful thing that you can do. So when you go to conferences, introduce yourself. Like, I promise you, when you first walk into that room and there's like 1,000 people there, they're all thinking the same thing most of the time. And it's that I don't recognize anyone here. Who the hell am I going to talk to? Don't get caught up in that imposter syndrome. Just go and talk to people. It doesn't even have to be about work, but build your network when you have opportunities to, because that's opportunities to review. And the final thing is, like, with certain publishers or journals, they may have call outs for reviews where they keep a database of reviewers that you can sign up to. Whenever you come across those opportunities and you think that journal publishes and things that might be relevant to you, sign up to it. You won't get heaps of reviews, particularly if it's a large database, but it will give you maybe 1 or 2 opportunities a year to review. Those would be my 3. I think I just gave 3, but those would be my 3.
I can just compliment what Pat said. When you're at conferences, check if there are any events, workshops, or sessions with editors of journals that may be present, or if there are booths, for example, with publishers. And if there are editors around, you can always ask them if you would like to review for the journal that they edit. So, would anyone else like to ask a question? If not, Pat, thank you again so much. I don't know if you can see the chat, but everyone is loving the content and the answers that you're providing. And I'm pretty sure that once we share the recording with the rest of the nodes, people will find it very useful. Always happy to have you around. And can I forward you any questions if people have further questions after they watch the recording?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's why I put my contact details up at the end. I will get into trouble one day, I'm sure, and I'll be getting too many questions, but I'm always available if anyone wants to ask a question, or if they just want to talk to someone in publishing and get advice. I'm here and always ready to listen. And yeah, as I feel like imposter syndrome has been a big thing throughout this whole presentation. Just to close out my TED talk, I would just say, don't let anything or anyone, even yourself, tell you that you're not good enough in academia, because you always will be. There's always going to be people who are going to try and bring you down or tell you or question your work, but it's just a part of academia. It's feeling that way. We're all here for a reason, and we're usually pretty good at what we do.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Pat, once again. And for everyone that is left, if you could please fill out this very quick survey from the ECOP node to help us continue tailoring some nice webinars. And just a quick preview for our April webinar, we're going to be talking about starting your own business. So hopefully that is of interest to a large part of our membership. Thanks everyone for attending. Thank you, Pat, again for coming, and have a lovely rest of the day to everyone.
Thanks, Rita.